Pat and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat and his black and white cat. All the birds are singing and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man. Everybody knows his bright red van. All his friends will smile as he waves to greet them. Maybe you can never be sure there'll be knock, ring, letters through your door. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat and his black and white cat. All the birds are singing and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man. Everybody knows his bright red van. All his friends will smile as he waves to greet them. Maybe you can never be sure there'll be knock, ring, letters through your door. Letters through your door. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat and his black and white cat. All the birds are singing and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man.
Postman Pat, The Treasure Hunt. Story by John Cunliffe. From the original television series. Pat is the Greendale postman. Every day he drives his red van up the valley, twisting along the twining roads, up and over the hills far away, down narrow lanes and tracks to farms and cottages. He brings letters and cards, newspapers and magazines, football pools and catalogues and bills and birthday cards, and parcels full of who knows what. He also brings a smile, a joke or a chat, news of the valley and who's doing what. He has a little black cat called Jess. Pat collects the day's post from the village post office. Mrs. Goggins sorts the letters and parcels ready for Pat to deliver, as well as looking after the shop. One sunny spring morning, Mrs. Goggins said,
"Just look at all these letters and parcels."
"Most of them seem to be for young Katie and Tom Pottage," said Pat.
"Well, of course. It's their birthday," said Mrs. Goggins, smiling.
"So it is," said Pat. "How excited they'll be when they see all their cards and parcels. I'd better be on my way. They'll be looking out for me. Goodbye."
"Goodbye, Pat."
Pat's first stop was at the village school. There were only 12 children there. Bill Thompson was the eldest, and he would look after the letters till Mr. Pringle arrived. This morning he dropped the letters right in a puddle. Sarah Gilbertson showed Pat a fossil. Then Lucy Selby came and asked Pat to play hopscotch. Soon Pat said, "I'll have to be on my way. The post mustn't be late. Not today of all days."
"What's special about today?" asked Sarah.
"Wait and see," said Pat. "Cheerio, I'll see you tomorrow." A little further along the road, Pat turned in at the gates of Greendale Farm. As soon as they heard Pat's van, Katie and Tom Pottage came running out to meet him. When they saw the pile of letters and parcels in Pat's arms, all for them, They couldn't wait to open them. As they are twins, it was a double birthday. They sat down on the grass and opened all their parcels. They had some lovely presents, but Katy did not seem pleased with hers. "What's up with Katy?" said Pat.
"Oh, she's wrong side out today," said Mrs. Pottage. "She's lost Sarah Ann."
"Is that the little doll she takes to school?"
"She takes her everywhere," said Mrs. Pottage. "She's lost without her. I don't know what we'll do if she doesn't turn up."
"She's sure to turn up somewhere," said Pat. "I'll look out for her. You never know. I might spot Sarah Ann on my travels. I'm good at finding things." "Poor Katy, she does look sad. I'll do my best. Don't worry now. Cheerio." Pat was on his way again in his red van. He told Jess about the lost doll. Where could Sarah Ann be? Jess kept a sharp lookout for any wandering dolls as they travelled from farm to farm. He could catch mice in the dark, so surely he could catch a doll in broad daylight. The next stop was the church. The Reverend Timms had heard Pat's van coming and was waiting for him. Pat told him about Katy's lost doll. "She could have left her in church," said the Reverend Timms. "She always brings her. Seek and thou shalt find. Let's have a look. Mind your head." They searched among the pews, looking under the seats, lifting hassocks, moving piles of hymn books, creeping about and popping up in unexpected places. Reverend Timms did find something, but it was not Sarah Ann. It was a lady's glove. "Let me see. I think I know that glove," said Pat. "Look, it has letters sewn inside. D.T. Dorothy Thompson. That's whose it must be. I'll take it along for her. She will be pleased." "Well, I hope Katy's doll does turn up," said the Reverend Timms. "Let the Lord guide you, and all will be well." "Thanks for helping," said Pat. "Goodbye." Pat drove up the steep hill to Thompson Ground. Mrs. Thompson was surprised when Pat gave her a glove with her letters.
"Well, I never," she said. "Where did you find my glove? I've been looking everywhere for it."
Pat told her about Katy's doll being lost. "We were looking in the church for it, and the Reverend found your glove instead."
"Well, Katy and her mum did call in for a cup of tea on Monday. She could have left her doll here. Perhaps it's under a cushion. We'd better have a look."
They searched everywhere. They lifted cushions, they looked under chairs and behind chairs. They peered behind the television set and amongst the coats that hung on the back of the door. They even moved the sideboard out from the wall to see if Sarah Ann had slipped down the back. It was no good. They didn't find Katy's doll, but Mrs. Thompson found a knife down the side of a chair. "That's Ted Glenn's knife," said Pat. "It's his rabbiting knife. I'll take it along for him," said Pat. "He will be pleased to have it back."
"I hope you find Katy's doll," said Mrs. Thompson.
"We'll keep looking. See you tomorrow. Cheerio."
"Cheerio, Pat."
Pat drove down the steep and winding road and along the valley to Ted Glenn's cottage. Jess kept a sharp lookout for the lost doll. "What a day," said Pat. "We found a glove and a knife, but no Sarah Ann. I wonder if we will find her. I do hope so." Jess twitched his whiskers hopefully. Ted Glenn was delighted to see his knife. He couldn't guess where Pat had found it. Pat told him about Katy's lost doll. Ted said, "They popped in yesterday with a lamp they wanted mending. She could have left the doll here." So they went to have a look in Ted's workshop. What a jumble it was. There were toys and television sets, cookers and cake stands, bikes and roller skates, farm machines and house machines, more than you could count. Goodness knows when Ted would mend them all. They lifted things, they fell over things. Things fell on them. They moved things, they pushed things. They looked over things, they looked round things, under things, behind things, between things, beside things. They did not find Sarah Ann. But Ted found a watch that he'd mended, then forgotten about.
"That's Miss Hubbard's," he said. "She brought it to be fettled last Christmas. Could you take it along for her, Pat? She'll be needing it."
"Certainly, I'm going that way."
"I hope you find the doll,"
said Ted.
"So do I," said Pat. "I seem to be able to find plenty of other things."
Miss Hubbard was doing her shopping in Sam's mobile shop when Pat arrived. She was pleased to see Pat, and even more pleased when he gave her a watch with her letters. She couldn't guess where Pat had found it. Pat told her about Katie's lost doll, but she hadn't seen her. "Poor Katie," said Pat, "and on her birthday too. I'll buy her a box of chocolates to cheer her up as we haven't found Sarah Ann." Pat took a box of chocolates from the shelf of the mobile shop. There was something else on the shelf. A squashed-up something that had been behind the box of chocolates. "What's that?" said Pat. "Behind your chocolates?"
"I don't know," said Sam. "It's nothing I put there."
Pat pulled the bundle out and straightened it and smoothed it. "I know what it is," he said.
"It's a doll," said Miss Hubbard.
"I don't sell dolls,"
said Sam.
"It isn't a new one," said Miss Hubbard.
"It's Katie's doll," said Pat. "There's her name sewn in the skirt. It must be Sarah Ann, the one we've been looking for all day."
"That young Katie Pottage," said Sam. "She gets everywhere."
"I'll take the chocolates anyway," said Pat. "They'll make a nice birthday present." When Pat arrived at the twins' birthday party with Sarah Ann and the chocolates, Katie smiled properly for the first time that day. She hugged Sarah Ann and Pat and Jess and said thank you to them all. It was a lovely party. "Time we were going," said Pat. "Goodbye, everyone. Have a good time."
"Goodbye, Pat."
"Bye, Pat."
"Goodbye."
"Goodbye."
Everyone called, and off went Pat and Jess in their red van. Pat still had to collect the letters from the letterbox and tell Mrs. Goggins all about his treasure hunt for Katie's lost doll.
Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat and his black and white cat. All the birds are singing and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man.
Postman Pat, the Mystery Thief. Story by John Cunliffe from the original television series. Pat was hurrying along the road in his van, over a hill and round a corner. He had to jam his brakes on, because the road was full of sheep. Jess popped his head out to have a look. A big ram pushed up to the van, right in Jess's face. What a fright they both had. Peter Fogg was driving his sheep across the road. He opened a gate, and the sheep went into the field, baaing and following their leader. Peter waved as he fastened the gate, and Pat went on his way. Pat soon had to stop again, this time for a herd of cows. They walked slowly by. Mr. Thompson was walking behind them. He waved his stick and shouted,
Get up then!
But it made no difference. The cows mooed, stopped to munch the roadside grasses, and took their time. The road was clear at last. Mr. Thompson waved to Pat, and Pat was on his way again. Pat stopped at the village school. "What lovely flowers," he said to Charlie Pringle.
"They're for our spring display," said Charlie. "Look, here comes Lucy, and Katie and Tom."
They all had something special. Lucy Selby had brought a basket of eggs, and Tom Pottage a box of day-old chicks. Bill Thompson brought a cup of tea for Pat and collected the letters. Then Pat was off again, away up the steep hills and winding roads. In and out of farmyards he went, delivering cards and letters and parcels. There was a packet of medicines for Mr. Forsyth, the vet, and a letter about the football pools for George Lancaster. "I wonder if he's won," said Pat. But George was out on the fells, so he couldn't ask him. It was almost dinner time, and Pat was near Thompson Ground. "What a nice place for a picnic," he said. So he parked his van and locked the door. They found a sunny place to sit in the field. Some of Mrs. Thompson's hens were scratching about along the hedges. Pat could see the Thompsons' farm on the hillside just below where he was sitting. He thought he could almost peep down the chimney and see Mrs. Thompson putting the kettle on the fire. Jess was thinking about Pat's sandwich box and hoping there was a tin of sardines in it. Pat put the box on the grass with his keys neatly beside it. Jess was in luck. There was a whole tin of sardines to share with Pat, as well as sandwiches, an apple, a yoghurt, and a big slice of cherry cake. It was so warm in the sun that both Pat and Jess began to feel sleepy. They closed their eyes. Mrs. Thompson's hens were not a bit sleepy. They had spotted Pat's food too. They pecked their way nearer and nearer to Pat and Jess and the open sandwich box. A noise wakened Pat. 2 hens were running away with sandwiches in their beaks, and a third was pecking at the yoghurt. Pat shouted and chased the hens, but he couldn't catch them. Jess chased another into the hedge. Pat ran back to the sandwich box just in time to see another cheeky hen running away with his keys in her beak. He chased her down the hill, but she spread her wings and flew into a tree. "Oh, my keys!" said Pat. "I can't open my van without them. Dear me, it's a long time since I climbed a tree, but I'd better try." Jess glared up at the hen. He could easily climb, but he knew that he couldn't get down again. The cheeky hen sat on a high branch with the keys in her beak, looking down at Pat and Jess. Pat began to climb nearer and nearer to the hen. He was just reaching out to grab the keys when the hen dropped them into a hollow in the tree and flew off with a loud squawk. Pat put his foot on a rotten branch. Crack! He came tumbling down. He landed in the middle of a prickly bush. It scratched and prickled him all over. Mrs. Thompson came running to see what was going on. She pulled Pat out of the bush and pulled the prickles out of him. He told her all about the thieving hens.
"Dear me," said Mrs. Thompson. "That hen must think she's a magpie. They're the ones for taking anything shiny. We'd better get a ladder and see if we can find your keys."
So they went for the ladder and leaned it against the tree. Pat climbed up easily now. Whilst Mrs. Thompson held the ladder, Pat looked amongst the branches and found the hollow where the hen had dropped the keys. He found a lot of other things there too. "It's like a magpie's nest," he said. He brought it all down to show Mrs. Thompson. There were all kinds of shiny things, bits of glass, wire, a milk bottle top, buttons, a doll's eye, and something larger among the bits and glittery pieces, as well as Pat's keys.
"That's my wedding ring! I thought I'd lost it down the sink," cried Mrs. Thompson. "I am glad to see it again."
She wiped it on her dress and put it on her finger. When they had put the ladder away, she said,
"My hens have stolen your sandwiches, so you'd better come and have some dinner with me. There's plenty to spare."
Pat was glad he lost his sandwiches when he saw what a good dinner Mrs. Thompson had cooked. So was Jess. He had a tasty plate of fish. It was all much better than the best of sandwiches. Mrs. Thompson was happy too, to see her ring shining on her finger once more. It was time to be on the way, and Pat said goodbye and thank you to Mrs. Thompson. As they drove along, Pat's pocket jingled with all the shiny things he had found in the tree. "Just fancy," he said, "a magpie hen. Who ever heard of such a thing?" Jess wondered what a magpie cat would collect. They saw the mobile shop, and Pat stopped to have a chat with Sam. He told him the story of the magpie hen. "I wonder if that's where my tie pin went," said Sam. Pat showed him the hen's collection. There were no tie pins among the glittery bits. Pat went on his way. He had some letters for Miss Hubbard, and he told her about the magpie hen.
"Well," she said, "I lost a silver earring last month and a hatpin. I wonder if they're up a tree somewhere. That hen could have another hoard in another tree. I must go and see Mrs. Thompson and have a good look."
Along by Garner Bridge, Pat met George Lancaster and stopped to tell him about the thieving hen. George couldn't think of anything he'd lost, but he thought it made a good story. "You might have won something," said Pat. "There's a letter for you about the pools." "Is there? I'll be off then," said George. On the way home, Pat saw some real magpies and wondered if they had taught Mrs. Thompson's hens how to steal. As for Jess, he was asleep.
Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. All the birds are singing, and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man. Everybody knows his bright red van. All his friends will smile as he waves to greet them. Maybe you can never be sure there'll be knock, ring, letters through your door. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. All the birds are singing, and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. All the birds are singing, and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man.
Postman Pat, The Secret. Story by John Cunliffe, from the original television series. It was a special day for Pat. He sang as he drove along the valley. It was a happy day too. Jess sat beside him and twitched his whiskers. "Now, young Jess, don't you give my secret away," said Pat. Jess said not one word about it. When Pat arrived at the village post office, Mrs. Goggins was looking out for him. She was looking very pleased about something.
"Hello, Pat," she said. "There's a lot of post today."
Who could be writing all these letters to Pat? One had a drawing of a cat on it. The writing looked like Katie Pottage's.
"Why don't you open them?" said Mrs. Goggins.
So Pat did. What a surprise! They were all birthday cards. There was one from every person on his round. How did they all know that it was his birthday? Now it was no longer a secret.
"How did they know?" said Mrs. Goggins. "Well, I didn't tell them. Happy birthday, Pat, and many happy returns."
Pat bought 6 chocolate kittens, then gathered up all his cards and the day's letters and went on his way. At Greendale Farm, the twins sang "Happy Birthday to You" when Pat came in with the letters, and Mrs. Pottage joined in too. He showed them all his cards, then Mrs. Pottage whisked a cloth off the table, and there was a birthday cake, with an icing sugar post office van on it, and pink letters saying, "Birthday greetings to Postman Pat." There was a sugar mouse for Jess. "But how did you know it was my birthday?" said Pat.
"We're not telling," said Mrs. Pottage. "It's a secret."
"It was a secret," sighed Pat. "But all the same, thank you very much. It is a lovely cake." Pat went on his way. The church was the next stop. "Here's something for your birthday," said the Reverend Timms. He gave Pat a Bible bound in leather. "That's very kind of you," said Pat. "But how did you know it was my birthday?" "He who reads shall learn," said the Reverend. "Oh," said Pat, puzzled. How could the Bible tell the secret of his birthday? Jess wondered if it was a sugar Bible. Pat drove away up the winding, hilly roads to Thompson Ground. Mrs. Thompson was looking at Pat's birthday cards when Alf came in. "Hello, Pat," he said. "Happy birthday." He gave Pat a walking stick with a curly sheep's horn for a handle. "Thank you," said Pat. "It will be very useful. But how did you know it was my birthday?" "Oh, you're a famous postman, you know," said Alf, smiling. Whatever does he mean? Thought Pat as he waved goodbye. He was getting more and more puzzled, and his van was filling up with presents. Jess didn't like the walking stick. He thought it might poke him when he wasn't looking. When Pat called on Granny Dryden, she gave him a woolly vest that she had knitted specially. It looked very itchy. Miss Hubbard gave him a steering wheel cover made of red velvet to keep his hands warm in winter. At Intake Farm, George Lancaster gave Pat 24 eggs, all different colours. When Pat met Sam Waldron along the road with his mobile shop, Sam gave him a big box of strawberries and a carton of cream. Pat called at the village school. The children sang 2 songs that they had been practising and gave Pat a big model of his van that they had made specially. Pat gave them a chocolate kitten each to say thank you for all their cards. When he asked how they knew about his birthday, the children smiled, pressed fingers to their lips and said nothing. It was time for Pat to go home. Sarah would have a special birthday tea ready for him. He stopped to empty the letterbox. Peter Fogg came along on his tractor and stopped for a chat. Pat told him about how everyone knew his birthday.
Don't you know why?
Said Peter, laughing. I certainly do not, said Pat. Peter pulled the Pencaster Gazette out of his pocket.
Look at this,
he said. Pat was amazed. There was a big headline, Happy Birthday to the Postman of the Year. Well, said Pat, so that's how everyone knew. I wonder how they found out.
Keep it as a souvenir,
said Peter. Thanks, said Pat, and that surely is my last present today. Jess wondered when his birthday could be. Never mind, there would be a good dinner waiting for him. That was as good as a birthday any time. What a strange day, said Pat. We've finished up with a van full of letters and parcels. And off they went home. Jess didn't have his usual catnap. He wanted to keep an eye on that sheep's horn, just in case it tried anything funny.
Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat.
Postman Pat, Letters on Ice. Story by John Cunliffe, from the original television series. Greendale was having a hard winter, and there had been a lot of snow in the night. It was icy as well. Postman Pat was out on his rounds as usual, but he had to go very carefully. Sam Waldron was out too, with his mobile shop.
Hello, Pat,
called Sam.
Rough weather?
Hello, Sam. How's it going?
Well, I don't think I'll be able to get up to Granny Dryden's with her groceries, said Sam. I got stuck up there yesterday.
I'll take them with the letters, said Pat. My van's good in snow.
Oh, thanks, Pat. Mind how you go.
Sam handed Pat a box full of groceries, packets of tea, biscuits, butter, bread, flour, bacon, sausages, and a big tin of humbugs.
That'll keep her going for a while,
said Pat.
Thanks, said Sam. Cheerio!
And Pat was on his way. The van skidded and slithered along the steep road to Granny Dryden's house. She was very glad to see him, especially when she saw he had her groceries, as well as a letter. Pat called out cheerfully as he came in.
Good morning.
Oh, thank you, Pat. That's lovely, said Granny Dryden. This letter will be from that lass of mine in London. I cannot find my reading glasses anywhere. Would you tell me what she says, Pat?
Certainly. Now, let's see. Pat tore the envelope open and read aloud. She says, Dear Mum, just a line to let you know...
Speak up, please, Pat, said Granny Dryden. I can't hear you.
Pat went on. We'll be able to come up to Greendale to see you for your birthday. Jim started school this week, and Dad's bought a new car. We're all well and hoping you are too. All our love, Sally and family.
That's good news. Thanks, Pat. Have a cup of tea.
Thank you, Mrs. Dryden. It's just the thing, this cold weather. Pat enjoyed his cup of strong hot tea. Well, I'll be on my way before it starts snowing again. Goodbye.
Bye, Pat.
Pat's next stop was at Ted Glenn's workshop. Morning, Ted.
Hello, Pat.
Pat went to warm himself by Ted's stove. That's a grand stove you've got there, he said. I could do with that in my van. Ooh, it's lovely. He had a letter for Ted. Here's someone writing from a warm place. Australia.
It'll be our Bert, said Ted. It's ages since he's written. That reminds me, I found Bert's old skates this morning. I reckon they'll be just about your size, Pat. Do you fancy trying them? They say the tan's frozen hard.
Pat looked at the skates. Well, I don't know, he said. I'd love to have a go. Is it safe?
Aye, it's all right, said Ted. Miss Hubbard tested the ice this morning. You never know when skates might come in handy.
Thanks, Ted. Cheerio. Pat was off again along the snowy roads. The wind was blowing the snow into drifts deeper and deeper. Soon he had to stop. The road was blocked with a huge drift of snow. Pat thought he would never get through with his letters now. Then he looked across to the lake and saw George Lancaster on the ice. That gave Pat an idea. It's worth trying, Jess. I can take a shortcut across the ice.
Come on, Pat, George shouted. It's lovely.
You stay here, Jess, and mind the van, said Pat. I'll just put these skates on. Pat laced the skates up firmly, got his bag of letters, and walked carefully out onto the ice.
Here we go.
What a time Pat had. He toppled and teetered and nearly fell over many a time. He went whirling round in circles. He just missed a tree, then had to grab a branch to stop himself. Somehow he skated across the ice. Charlie Pringle looked over the wall and spotted him.
"Hello, Pat," he called. He was very surprised to see Pat arriving on skates instead of in his van.
Hello, Charlie, said Pat. Special ice delivery today. He handed the letters over the wall.
Thank you, said Charlie. Good skating.
Pat whizzed off again. George was still on the ice. He did get a surprise when Pat shot by with a letter for him. Mrs. Thompson was out for a spin too. When Pat tried to spin round on the ice, he fell down with a bump.
Hello, Pat, said Mrs. Thompson. Are you all right? What you doing down there?
Just out for a spin, said Pat, and gave her some letters.
Oh, look at Jess, said Mrs. Thompson.
Jess had come to try his paws at skating. His paws went in all directions at once. Come on, Jess, said Pat. That's enough skating for today. We'll go home on wheels. Pat backed his van out of the snowdrift and went on his way. When Pat arrived at the school, there was no one there. They were all snowed up at home, but they had left a snowman to wait for Pat. Pat had an old envelope in his pocket, so he addressed it to the snowman. Mr. Snowman, The Drift, Greendale School, and tucked it under the snowman's arm. Then the school door opened. It wasn't empty after all. Hello, said Pat. It was Ted Glenn and Miss Hubbard.
Hello, Pat, said Miss Hubbard. Have you seen my bike?
It'll be somewhere under this snow, said Pat. They all searched in the deep snow. Pat thought he saw a handlebar sticking out of the snow, but it was only an old kettle. They found the bike at last.
Just in time for choir practice, said Miss Hubbard. I'll be off now.
Pat opened the gate for her.
Thank you, Pat. Goodbye.
Bye, Miss Hubbard.
Nothing stops her, does it? Said Ted.
See you in church on Sunday, called Miss Hubbard, as she wobbled off along the snowy road.
Pat could hear meowing from the van. How Jess hated the cold. Cheer up, Jess, said Pat. I'm coming now. It's time to go home. And this snow can't last forever.
Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat.
Postman Pat, The Breezy Day. Story by John Cunliffe, from the original television series. It was a breezy day in Greendale. The leaves swirled about the road. The wind blew and buffeted Pat's van as he drove along the valley with the post. "Hang on, Jess," he said. "It's a right job driving in this wind." A scrap of paper blew across his windscreen. "Help! I can't see!" The wind was so strong that people could hardly stand up. They passed Alf Thompson along the road, and he was nearly blown off his feet. He had to hold his hat on with his stick. Pat drove over the hill and round a corner. He shouted, "Look out!" and stood on the brakes. A tree had blown down and fallen right across the road. Pat stopped just in time. He got out of the van to have a good look. How are we going to get past this lot? Jess came to have a look too. He prowled along the fallen branches. He thought it made a lovely place to climb and play. Pat heard a voice. "Hello, Pat!" It was Peter Fogg. "This wretched wind," said Peter, "blowing trees down all over the place. Don't worry, Pat. I'll soon shift it. I'll nip down to the forestry place and borrow their lifting tackle. I won't be long." Pat went to have a look at the tree's roots. "No wonder it blew over," he said. "It's rotten." Peter was soon back on his tractor with the lifting tackle. He had a big power saw too. "Now then, we'll soon cut through this. Stand back," he said as he started the power saw with a shattering roar. "These things don't half go." He lopped the branches off and Pat carried them into the field. Then Peter sliced the tree into pieces. "Now then," he said, "let's see if we can move it." He backed the lifting tackle up to the tree. It was like a small crane. He fixed the chain round a piece of the trunk and started the motor up. It lifted the heavy wood into the air. He dragged the log into the field. He came back for another piece of tree, and another, until he had cleared a good gap. "We should be able to get through there," said Pat. He went to get his van, but it had gone. Oh, where could it be? He walked along the road, looking for it. It was parked at the side of the road, next to Sam's mobile shop. "I moved your van a bit," said Sam. "I could see your new paint was going to get scratched with all these branches flying about." "Thanks, Sam," said Pat. "I'll be on my way now. Peter's managed to clear the road. Cheerio." "Cheerio, Pat." Peter was moving the last of the logs. Pat waved to him and called, "Thanks, Peter. Cheerio," as he went through. "We'll have to get a move on now, Jess," said Pat. But just as he said it, the engine began to make funny noises. Now what? The van jerked, coughed, shook, and stopped. Pat got out and lifted the bonnet to look at the engine. Just as he was bending over to see better, the wind snatched his hat and blew it along the road. "Help! My hat!" It rolled along the road with Pat chasing after it. It blew over the wall into the stream and floated away. "Oh, no," said Pat. "I'll never catch it now." He went back to the van. He mended a broken wire and soon was on his way again. There was nobody about at the village school. Have they all been blown away? Said Pat. Then he saw the children. They were outside playing in the wind. But the wind wanted to deliver the letters. It snatched them out of Pat's hand and delivered them in all directions. It blew them across the meadow, behind stones, over walls, and into bushes. The children helped to find them. One letter was stuck in a tree. Bill Thompson climbed up to get it. "Careful," said Pat. "What a day. Hold them tightly. I think they're all air letters today." Pat blew about the valley all morning with his letters and parcels. It was almost the end of his windy round when he saw a flying towel. It was one of Granny Dryden's. He went to help her catch it. Her washing had blown across the garden and planted itself all over the place. In the bushes, amongst the roses, on the lawn, behind the shed, everywhere.
"Oh, Pat," said Granny Dryden, "this wind's terrible. You are a dear. I'd never have caught it all by myself. Look, there's more over there."
Pat helped to gather it all in.
"Now we've got my washing," said Granny Dryden. "What about your hat?"
"It blew off miles away," said Pat, "and sailed down a stream."
"Good gracious," said Granny Dryden. "Ted Glenn said he looked a postman's hat out of the lake. I didn't know it was yours. He popped it on the old scarecrow to dry."
There it was, standing in the next field. "It looks like mine," said Pat, and walked across for a closer look. "It is mine." He took it off the scarecrow and shook out the creases. "Thanks, Mr. Scarecrow." Then Pat waved to Granny Dryden. "Time to blow home," he said, and off he went home to tea, with Jess curled up asleep in his basket.
Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all